I'm Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hayes. I'm 38, and I've spent the last 15 years leading some of the most classified operations in naval special warfare. Last Saturday, I walked into my cousin's wedding in Millfield Creek and watched her introduce me as nobody special to a room full of guests, 30 minutes before a team of Navy SEALs stood at attention and addressed me as Commander in front of everyone who'd spent years pretending I didn't exist. 4 years. That's how long it's been since anyone from the Thornfield side of my family bothered to acknowledge my existence. Not when I received the Navy Cross for Valor Under Fire, not when I became the youngest female officer to command a SEAL training division, not even when my photo appeared on the cover of Naval Intelligence Weekly after successfully extracting 12 hostages from a compound in Syria that had been considered impossible to breach. But somehow, my cousin Delilah Thornfield managed to track down my secure mailing address to send me a wedding invitation, cream-colored cardstock with gold lettering, and a handwritten note tucked inside that read, "Try not to embarrass the family." What Delilah didn't know, what none of them knew, was that among her husband-to-be's groomsmen were 3 men I'd personally trained at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado: Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell, Petty Officer First Class Jape Rodriguez, and Senior Chief Alex Thompson. The same elite operators who'd followed me through hell and back during Operation Silent Thunder, where we dismantled an international arms trafficking ring that had been feeding weapons to terrorist cells across 3 continents. These weren't just any Navy SEALs, they were my SEALs. And when Delilah stood up during the reception, wine glass in hand, and announced to the entire room that I was just Victoria, our little cousin who never really amounted to much, Ryan stepped forward, rendered a crisp salute, and said in a voice that carried across the entire ballroom, "Ma'am, requesting permission to address the room about Lieutenant Commander Hayes' service record." The silence that followed was deafening. 300 wedding guests turned to stare at me, the same woman they'd been ignoring all evening. Delilah's face went pale as she realized she just publicly humiliated the commanding officer of some of the most elite warriors in the United States military. My Aunt Caroline, who'd spent 20 years telling anyone who'd listened that I was wasting my life playing soldier, suddenly looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. And my Uncle Bernard, who'd once called my military service a phase I'd grow out of, stood frozen with his mouth half open as 3 decorated Navy SEALs positioned themselves between me and the crowd, like a human shield of respect. But the real shock came when Jake stepped forward and began recounting the details of Operation Midnight Rescue, a mission so classified that most people in that room didn't even know it had happened. How I led a team of 12 operators into hostile territory to extract a kidnapped diplomat's daughter. How we spent 72 hours behind enemy lines, moving through terrain that military strategists had deemed unsurvivable. How I personally carried that 16-year-old girl to safety while taking sniper fire, never leaving a man behind, never compromising the mission, never backing down even when our extraction helicopter was shot down and we had to fight our way to the secondary rendezvous point on foot. The Thornfield family had always been prominent in Millfield Creek. Old money, old names, old traditions. They owned the largest real estate development company in 3 counties. They sat on every important board, attended every charity gala, made sure their names appeared in the society pages of the Millfield Gazette every Sunday. To them, success meant country club memberships and vacation homes in the Hamptons. It meant having the right connections, wearing the right clothes, marrying into the right families. Military service? That was something other people's children did, something desperate kids from broken homes pursued when they couldn't get into decent colleges or find respectable jobs. When I enlisted at 18, fresh out of Millfield Creek High School with a 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship to Princeton that I'd turned down, they didn't just disapprove, they acted like I'd died. My grandmother, Elizabeth Thornfield, actually held a memorial dinner the night I left for basic training, complete with a framed photo of me on the mantel and speeches about the granddaughter we lost to poor judgment. My mother, caught between her military daughter and her wealthy family, chose silence. She'd send birthday cards with no return address, Christmas gifts through mutual friends, always with unsigned notes that said things like, "Proud of you, but can't say so out loud." For 20 years, I'd been the family ghost, the embarrassing relative they'd trained themselves not to mention. When other families gathered for holidays and shared updates about their children's accomplishments, the Thornfields would simply skip over me like I'd never existed. When local newspapers wrote articles about my military achievements, they'd make sure those papers never made it into the country club reading room. When my commanding officer called to inform them that I'd been awarded the Silver Star for leading a rescue mission that saved 43 civilian lives, my Aunt Caroline told him he had the wrong number. The wedding invitation was the first communication I'd received from any of them in 4 years. No phone call, no explanation, just an expectation that I'd show up, smile politely, and play the role of the quiet family disappointment who knew her place. The RSVP card didn't even have a line for a guest. They'd assumed I'd be coming alone, probably because they figured no one respectable would want to associate with their military embarrassment of a cousin.
What they couldn't have predicted was that Delilah's fiancé, Thomas Wellington, had specifically requested that several of his military colleagues attend the wedding. Thomas was a former Marine who'd transitioned into private security consulting, and he'd handpicked these Navy SEALs not just as groomsmen, but as a way to honor the military connections that had shaped his career. He had no idea that the nobody special cousin his bride-to-be kept dismissing was the same Lieutenant Commander Hayes who'd personally trained half of his former teammates and earned a reputation in special operations circles as one of the most effective and respected leaders in naval special warfare. The irony was perfect. The family that had spent decades trying to erase me from their narrative had unknowingly invited the very people who knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished. And now, as I stood in that opulent ballroom wearing my dress blues, the same uniform they'd always been ashamed of, I was about to watch 3 of the most elite warriors in the world give them a masterclass in exactly what they'd been too proud and too foolish to recognize. But this story isn't just about family rejection or military vindication. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to know you best choose to know you least. It's about finding your worth in places your family never thought to look. And it's about the moment when the truth becomes so undeniable that even the most stubborn prejudices have no choice but to crumble. The wedding reception was about to become something none of us would ever forget. What my cousin Delilah didn't know, what none of the Thornfield family knew, was that her soon-to-be husband, Thomas Wellington, owed his entire security consulting empire to recommendations I'd written 3 years ago. The same Thomas who'd hired those Navy SEALs as his groomsmen, the same elite operators who'd spent countless hours in my training simulations at the Advanced Combat Training Center in Bridgeport, Virginia. When Thomas was transitioning out of the Marines, struggling to land his first private security contract, he'd submitted my name as a character reference without knowing we were related. His application had crossed my desk at DevGru, where I was reviewing former Marines for high-clearance consulting positions. Thomas Wellington, exemplary service record, solid tactical thinking, the kind of operator who could bridge military precision with civilian security needs. I'd written a glowing recommendation that opened doors to contracts with Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. That recommendation became the foundation of Wellington Security Solutions, now a multi-million-dollar firm. But Thomas had no idea that Lieutenant Commander V. Hayes on his reference letter was the same disappointing cousin Victoria that Delilah constantly complained about. In his mind, I was just another military contact from his network, someone whose endorsement carried weight in defense contracting circles. He'd never connected the dots because Delilah had trained him, like she'd trained everyone else, to think of her military cousin as irrelevant. The 3 Navy SEALs standing beside him as groomsmen weren't just random military friends Thomas had invited to add prestige to his wedding. They were specifically chosen because of their connection to the naval special warfare community, the same community where my reputation preceded me into every briefing room, every training facility, every classified operation planning session. Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell had been one of my most promising trainees at the Advanced Combat Training Center in Bridgeport, Virginia. I'd personally selected him for accelerated leadership development after watching him navigate a hostage rescue simulation that had stumped veteran operators with twice his experience. During his final evaluation, I'd told him something that became his personal motto. Excellence isn't about being perfect under ideal conditions. It's about being unbreakable when everything goes wrong. He had those words embroidered inside his tactical vest. Petty Officer First Class Jake Rodriguez had served under my command during Operation Serpent Strike, a joint task force mission to dismantle a human trafficking network operating between Mexico and Southern California. For 6 months, we'd worked 18-hour days, building intelligence networks and coordinating with international law enforcement. Jake had been my communications specialist, the guy who kept our team connected when we were operating in areas where normal radio equipment failed. I'd personally recommended him for promotion after he jury-rigged a satellite uplink using spare parts and a car battery, maintaining our connection to headquarters during a critical 72-hour window that ultimately led to the rescue of 127 victims. Senior Chief Alex Thompson was perhaps the most significant connection of all. He'd been the senior enlisted advisor during my first command at Naval Special Warfare Unit 2, and he'd witnessed firsthand the transformation of our training protocols under my leadership. When I arrived, the unit had a 40% dropout rate during advanced underwater demolition training. Within 18 months, using psychological preparation techniques I'd developed, we'd reduced that rate to 12% while actually increasing the difficulty of the course. Alex was skeptical at first, a grizzled veteran with 22 years of service who'd seen plenty of young officers come and go with big ideas. But after watching my methods produce the most psychologically resilient SEALs the unit had ever graduated, he'd become one of my most vocal advocates within the special operations community.
These weren't just any Navy SEALs that Thomas had chosen for his wedding party. They were 3 men whose careers had been directly shaped by my leadership, my training methods, my operational decisions. They knew my voice, knew my tactical philosophy, knew the way I moved through briefing rooms and command centers. To them, I wasn't some abstract military figure. I was Commander Hayes, the officer who'd pushed them to become the elite warriors they were today. The irony was breathtaking. Delilah had spent years describing me to Thomas as the family failure, the cousin who'd thrown her life away on military service instead of pursuing something meaningful like business or law or medicine. She'd painted a picture of someone who was wasting her potential, someone who'd chosen a dead-end career that would never amount to anything significant. In Delilah's version of my story, I was a cautionary tale about what happened when smart women made poor choices. But Thomas, unknowingly, had built his entire post-military success on the foundation of my professional reputation. Every major contract he'd landed, every high-profile client he'd secured, every door that had opened for Wellington Security Solutions, it all traced back to that character reference I'd written, the one that established him as someone worthy of trust in the most exclusive circles of private security contracting. And now, those 3 Navy SEALs, the men he'd specifically chosen to honor the military connections that had made his success possible, were about to come face to face with the woman whose influence had shaped their entire careers. They were about to see their former commander sitting at table 12, the overflow seating near the kitchen, where the Thornfield family had strategically placed their embarrassing relative, hoping she'd remain invisible throughout the entire celebration. The dramatic collision that was about to unfold wasn't just coincidence. It was the inevitable result of a family so determined to erase my existence that they'd failed to recognize my influence everywhere around them. They'd been so busy dismissing my achievements that they never bothered to understand what those achievements actually meant, or how far my reputation extended into the circles they desperately wanted to impress. The wedding reception was about to become a masterclass in unintended consequences, and I was about to watch 20 years of family denial crash into the unvarnished truth about exactly who Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hayes really was in the world beyond Millfield Creek's narrow definitions of success.
Have you ever been completely invisible to your own family? Not just misunderstood or underappreciated, but actually erased from their narrative so thoroughly that they introduce you to strangers as if you're nobody worth knowing? Comment 1 if you've lived through family rejection that made you question your own worth. And comment 2 if you're still fighting to prove yourself to people who refuse to see who you've become. Because here's what I've learned in 15 years of military service, leading operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The people closest to you can sometimes be the blindest to who you really are. They get so attached to their version of your story, the version that makes them comfortable, the version that fits their worldview, that they'll ignore mountains of evidence proving them wrong. The Thornfield family had constructed an entire mythology around my life that bore no resemblance to reality. In their version, I was the confused teenager who threw away a Princeton scholarship because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I was the family disappointment who'd chosen military service as an escape from responsibility rather than embracing it. I was the cousin who'd never grown up, never settled down, never contributed anything meaningful to society beyond playing soldier in foreign countries. They tell this story at dinner parties, at family gatherings, whenever someone asked about me. Oh, Victoria, she's still in the military, you know? We keep hoping she'll come to her senses and do something with her education. They'd shake their heads with that mixture of pity and embarrassment that families reserve for relatives who've made choices they can't understand or respect. The subtext was always clear. Victoria was smart enough to have been something important, but she'd chosen to waste her potential on something as ordinary as military service. What made their dismissal even more painful was how completely they'd bought into their own narrative. This wasn't just public posturing. They genuinely believed that my 15-year career in naval special warfare was equivalent to working at a dead-end job that I was too stubborn to quit. They thought my deployments were glorified business trips. They thought my commendations were participation trophies. They thought my security clearance was just paperwork that made me feel important. I'd stopped trying to correct them years ago. How do you explain classified operations to people who think your job is basically summer camp for adults? How do you describe the weight of command responsibility to relatives who measure success by annual income and social media followers? How do you convey the honor of leading elite warriors when your family thinks honor is something you buy with country club memberships? The silence had become easier than the constant misunderstanding. Let them think what they wanted to think. Let them tell their version of my story. I had missions to plan, operators to train, national security objectives to accomplish. I had a team of the most elite warriors in the world who trusted me with their lives, who followed my orders without question, and who knew that my tactical decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure.
But here's the thing about family rejection that most people don't understand. It doesn't just hurt in the moment, it accumulates. Every missed phone call, every excluded invitation, every casual dismissal builds up like sediment in your soul. You start to internalize their version of your worth, even when you know it's wrong. You begin to question whether the respect you've earned in your professional life is real, or whether you're just fooling yourself the same way your family thinks you're fooling yourself. I'd catch myself sometimes, in quiet moments between operations, wondering if they were right. Maybe I was just hiding from real life in the structured world of military service. Maybe my achievements only mattered to other military people because we were all part of the same delusion. Maybe the civilian world, the world my family inhabited, was the real world, and everything I'd built my identity around was just an elaborate game that didn't actually matter. Those doubts would hit me at the strangest times. After successfully completing a mission that had taken months of planning and saved lives that would never know they'd been in danger. After receiving commendations from Pentagon officials who understood the significance of what my team had accomplished. After training sessions where I watched young sailors transform into confident operators who would go on to serve their country with distinction. Even in moments of professional triumph, I'd hear my Aunt Caroline's voice in my head. When is Victoria going to stop playing dress up and get a real job? The wedding invitation had forced me to confront that accumulated rejection head on. For the first time in 4 years, I'd have to sit in a room full of Thornfields and pretend that their dismissal didn't affect me. I'd have to smile politely while they introduced me as our cousin who's still in the military, with that tone that suggested I was going through a particularly long rebellious phase. I'd have to watch them celebrate Thomas Wellington's success that was built on my professional reputation, while treating me like I'd never accomplished anything worth mentioning. Part of me had wanted to decline the invitation. What was the point of subjecting myself to an evening of subtle humiliation and not so subtle condescension? What was the point of giving them another opportunity to make me feel like an outsider in my own family? But another part of me, the part that had been forged in combat zones and command centers, refused to let them define my worth through their absence. I'd faced down enemy combatants and hostile governments. I'd made life or death decisions under pressure that most people couldn't imagine. I'd earned the respect of warriors who measured courage not in words, but in actions under fire. I was Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hayes, and I'd forgotten that for far too long while trying to be acceptable to people who were determined never to accept me. The irony of what was about to unfold at Delilah's wedding reception wasn't lost on me. The family that had spent decades trying to diminish my significance was about to discover exactly how significant I was to the people they were trying to impress. The relatives who treated my military service as an embarrassment were about to meet 3 Navy SEALs who considered it an honor to serve under my command. But the real revelation wouldn't be about my professional achievements or my military reputation. It would be about what happens when people who've invested years in underestimating you suddenly realize they never knew you at all. So let me ask you again. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who should have known better? Have you ever had to choose between proving your worth to people who refused to see it or finding your worth among people who recognized it immediately? Because sometimes the most powerful moment in your life isn't when your family finally acknowledges who you are. Sometimes it's when you realize you don't need their acknowledgement to know your own value. The wedding reception was about to teach the Thornfield family a lesson they'd never forget. But more importantly, it was about to remind me of a truth I'd temporarily lost. Your worth isn't determined by the people who refuse to see it. The rejection didn't happen overnight. It started the day I walked into the Thornfield family estate on Maple Ridge Drive and announced that I was turning down Princeton to enlist in the Navy. I was 18, valedictorian of Millfield Creek High School, with acceptance letters from 7 Ivy League universities spread across my grandfather's mahogany desk like a hand of cards I was about to fold. My grandmother Elizabeth sat in her wingback chair, pearls catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She held my Princeton acceptance letter between 2 fingers like it was contaminated. "Victoria, darling, surely you're not serious about this military nonsense. The Thornfields have been sending their children to prestigious universities for 5 generations. We don't send them to boot camp." Uncle Bernard paced behind the desk, his face the particular shade of red he reserved for family crises that threatened the Thornfield reputation. "Do you understand what you're throwing away? Princeton, Victoria, Princeton. People would kill for this opportunity, and you want to waste it playing G.I. Jane?" But it was my mother's silence that cut the deepest. Patricia Thornfield Hayes sat perfectly still on the velvet settee, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. She hadn't spoken since I'd made my announcement 20 minutes earlier. The woman who'd raised me to think for myself, who taught me that integrity mattered more than appearances, suddenly seemed incapable of defending either principle when it came to her own family's expectations. "It's not about throwing anything away," I tried to explain. "It's about serving something bigger than myself. It's about running away," Delilah interrupted from the doorway. She was 22 then, fresh out of Duke, with a degree she'd never used and an engagement ring from the heir to a pharmaceutical fortune that had fallen through 3 months earlier.
It's about taking the easy path because you're too scared to compete in the real world. The real world? As if military service existed in some alternate universe where courage and sacrifice didn't count as real experiences? As if the men and women who defended our freedoms were somehow less real than the people who inherited their positions at Daddy's company? Delilah's right, Aunt Caroline chimed in, entering the room with the territorial confidence of someone who'd appointed herself keeper of family standards. Military service is fine for people who don't have other options. But you have every option, Victoria. You have opportunities that most people only dream about. Why would you choose to limit yourself? Limit myself. That phrase would echo in my head for years afterward. The idea that serving my country was somehow a limitation rather than an expansion of who I could become. The assumption that the only meaningful success was the kind that could be measured in social status and financial portfolios. My grandfather, the family patriarch who'd built the Thornfield real estate empire from nothing, finally spoke from behind his newspaper. In my day, young women didn't have these opportunities. They certainly didn't throw them away for romantic notions about duty and service. You'll regret this decision, Victoria. Mark my words. The meeting ended with an ultimatum disguised as concern. Take a gap year, they suggested. Think it over. Don't make any hasty decisions that would affect the rest of your life. But what they really meant was, conform to our expectations or face the consequences of disappointing us. I left for Navy boot camp 6 weeks later with a single suitcase and a letter from my mother that I didn't open until I was on the bus to Great Lakes Naval Station. Inside, she had written, "I'm proud of your courage, even if I can't say so out loud. Love, Mom." It was the last time she would acknowledge my choice in writing. The silence that followed was systematic and deliberate. When I graduated from boot camp as the honor recruit, the top performer in my entire division, no one from my family attended the ceremony. When I was accepted into officer candidate school, beating out candidates from Naval Academy and ROTC programs, my achievement didn't merit a phone call home. When I received my commission as an ensign, becoming the first person in my family to earn a military officer's rank, the Thornfield family newsletter somehow forgot to mention it. They developed an elaborate system of avoidance that would have been impressive if it weren't so hurtful. Family gatherings were scheduled around my leave periods, Christmas celebrations happened while I was deployed, birthday parties were planned for weekends when I was attending military training schools. It wasn't that they forgot I existed, it was that they actively organized their lives to make sure I didn't exist in their shared experiences. The few times I managed to attend family events, usually when I was between assignments and had unexpected leave time, I was treated like a distant acquaintance rather than a blood relative. Conversations would halt when I entered a room. Topics would shift away from anything that might require them to acknowledge my military service. They had developed a remarkable ability to discuss current events, international affairs, even wars and conflicts, without ever mentioning that someone at their dinner table was actively involved in defending the country they claimed to love. Delilah became particularly skilled at the art of dismissive introduction. At Cousin Margaret's wedding, she introduced me to her college friends as Victoria, who's doing something with the government. At Uncle Roy's retirement party, I became the cousin who travels a lot for work. At my grandfather's funeral, I was simply Patricia's daughter to people who'd known me since childhood but had been trained to forget everything I had accomplished since leaving Millfield Creek. The most painful moment came during my third deployment, when I was serving as a platoon commander in Afghanistan. My mother had suffered a minor heart attack, nothing like threatening, but serious enough to warrant family notification through Red Cross emergency channels. I'd requested emergency leave to come home, prepared to fly halfway around the world to be at her bedside. The call came from Aunt Caroline. "Victoria, oh good, they were able to reach you. Listen, your mother is fine, it was just a little scare, but we think it would be better if you didn't come home right now. You know how she gets upset when there's too much attention, and if you show up in uniform, people will ask questions. The doctors say she needs to avoid stress." I was the stress.
My presence, my uniform, my very existence as a military officer was something that needed to be managed and minimized to protect my mother's health. I stayed in Afghanistan, led my platoon through a successful mission to secure a strategically important valley, and earned a commendation for tactical excellence. Meanwhile, my family gathered around my mother's hospital bed and probably told her stories about everyone except the daughter who had wanted to cross an ocean to hold her hand. That's when I realized the truth about family rejection. It's not just about disapproval, it's about erasure. They weren't just disappointed in my choices, they were committed to pretending I hadn't made them. They weren't just ashamed of my military service, they were determined to act as if it didn't exist.
The wedding invitation, arriving 4 years later, felt like a test. Would I show up to smile politely while they continued their elaborate fiction? Would I allow them to introduce me as nobody special without challenging their carefully constructed narrative? Or would I finally stop trying to earn acceptance from people who'd decided long ago that acceptance wasn't something I deserved? The dress blues hanging in my closet represented 15 years of choices they'd refused to understand. The ribbons and medals represented achievements they'd refused to acknowledge. The rank insignia represented a level of responsibility and trust they'd refused to respect. But those same dress blues also represented something else, the proof that their version of my story had never been true, the evidence that their limitations had never been my limitations, the demonstration that their narrow definition of success had never been the only definition that mattered. Saturday night at Delilah's wedding, the Thornfield family was going to meet the Victoria Hayes they'd spent 20 years pretending didn't exist. The valet at Rosewood Manor looked confused when I handed him the keys to my rental car, a standard Ford sedan that looked distinctly out of place among the line of BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas snaking up the circular driveway. Behind me, a woman in a designer gown was complaining loudly to her husband about having to wait behind whoever drives that economy car, while adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet with obvious irritation. I'd chosen the dress blues deliberately, not the casual civilian clothes that might have helped me blend into the background, not the cocktail dress that might have satisfied their expectations of appropriate wedding guest attire. Full military dress uniform, complete with ribbon rack, rank insignia, and the Navy Cross that I'd earned during Operation Desert Shield 3 years earlier. If the Thornfield family wanted to be embarrassed by my military service, I was going to give them something worth being embarrassed about. The manor's grand foyer buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that comes with expensive wedding receptions. Women in couture gowns air-kissed acquaintances while carefully avoiding actual contact with their professionally applied makeup. Men in custom tuxedos discussed stock portfolios and golf handicaps, while servers in crisp white uniforms circulated with champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres that probably cost more than most people's monthly car payments. I spotted Aunt Caroline first, stationed near the guest book like a security checkpoint designed to screen arrivals for social acceptability. She wore emerald green silk that probably cost more than a junior sailor's monthly salary, and her smile had that practiced quality of someone who had perfected the art of looking welcoming while maintaining emotional distance. Her expression flickered when she saw me approaching, a momentary tightening around her eyes that suggested she'd hoped I might change my mind to attending at the last minute. But she recovered quickly, switching to the kind of overly bright tone she might use with a difficult child who'd shown up to a fancy restaurant in muddy clothes. "Victoria! Oh my goodness, you actually came! And you wore your uniform! How patriotic of you!" The word patriotic emerged from her lips like something distasteful she was trying to politely swallow. Behind her, I could see other family members beginning to notice my presence, their conversations pausing as they registered the sight of someone in military dress blues among their carefully curated gathering of civilian sophistication. "Hello, Aunt Caroline," I replied, keeping my voice steady and professional. Thank you for including me in Delilah's special day. She studied my uniform with the kind of expression usually reserved for examining something unpleasant that someone had tracked in on their shoes. Well, I suppose you didn't have anything else to wear. Military people probably don't get many opportunities to shop for formal clothes, do they? The insult was delivered with such casual precision that it took me a moment to fully process it. She'd managed to simultaneously dismiss my career, insult my financial situation, and suggest that my choice to wear my dress uniform was born from necessity rather than pride. It was masterful in its efficiency. Actually, I have plenty of formal civilian clothes. I chose to wear this because I'm proud of my service. Aunt Caroline's smile became even more strained. Of course you are, dear. Now let me show you to your table. She gestured toward a corner of the reception hall that seemed distinctly separated from the main dining area. We've seated you somewhere quiet where you'll be comfortable. The seating arrangement spoke volumes about my status in the family hierarchy. Table 12 was positioned behind a decorative pillar that effectively blocked it from view of the head table where the wedding party would be seated. It was close enough to the kitchen that servers would constantly be brushing past with dirty dishes and empty serving trays, but far enough from the dance floor that I'd be excluded from the evening's main social activities. My table mates were clearly the reception's social afterthoughts, elderly relatives who'd been included out of obligation, plus ones who didn't know anyone else at the wedding, and what appeared to be several of Thomas's work colleagues who didn't fit into the Thornfield family's social circles. I recognized the placement strategy immediately. It was the same kind of tactical positioning I'd used to isolate potential security threats during diplomatic events.
Victoria Hayes? The voice belonged to a woman I didn't recognize, though her Thornfield family resemblance was unmistakable. I'm Margaret Thornfield Wilson, Delilah's cousin from the Boston branch. I don't think we've met. She extended her hand with the kind of careful politeness that suggested she'd been briefed on who I was and warned to be diplomatically distant. I understand you're in the military. How interesting. What do you do there exactly? The question was asked with the tone of someone inquiring about a hobby that held no particular interest for them. Behind her, I could see other family members engaging in animated conversations about vacation homes and private school admissions, the kind of topics that reinforced their shared values and social connections. I'm a lieutenant commander in the Navy. I work in special operations. Margaret's expression suggested she had no idea what special operations meant and no particular interest in learning. Oh, that sounds busy. Do you get to travel much? I imagine military people move around quite a bit. She'd reduced my entire career to the equivalent of a travel-heavy sales job, something that kept me conveniently absent from family gatherings, but didn't require her to understand or acknowledge what I actually did for a living. Before I could respond, Delilah appeared beside our table like a vision in white silk and calculated charm. Her wedding dress probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, and she wore it with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that she deserved the best of everything. Victoria! I can't believe you actually showed up. She air-kissed my cheek with the kind of practiced affection that looked genuine from a distance, but felt completely hollow up close. And in uniform, too. How very you. The way she said you made it sound like a character flaw that she'd learned to tolerate with great patience and understanding. You look beautiful, Delilah, I said, because it was true, and because it was what you said to brides regardless of how they treated you. Congratulations on your marriage. She beamed with the kind of radiant happiness that comes from being the center of attention at an event designed entirely around celebrating you. I'm just so excited for everyone to meet Thomas. He's absolutely wonderful, successful, charming, everything a girl could want in a husband. The emphasis on successful felt deliberate, a subtle reminder that she'd managed to marry someone who met the family's standards for achievement and social status. I'm sure he is, I replied, maintaining the kind of diplomatic neutrality I'd learned in hostage negotiation training. Oh, you'll love him. He's former military, too, actually. Marines. But he's done so well for himself since then. Built this amazing security consulting business from nothing. Really made something of himself, you know? The implication was clear. Thomas had been smart enough to use his military service as a stepping stone to real success, while I had apparently gotten stuck in the stepping stone phase. He'd leveraged his Marine background into civilian achievement, while I'd remained trapped in the limited world of military service. That's wonderful, I said, maintaining the kind of diplomatic neutrality I'd learned in hostage negotiation training. I'm sure his military background serves him well in business. Oh, it does, Delilah agreed enthusiastically. He has all these connections from his service days. Can you believe it? Some of his groomsmen are Navy SEALs, real elite military people. Thomas says they're some of the most impressive men he's ever worked with. She spoke about Navy SEALs the way someone might describe exotic animals at a zoo, fascinating creatures that existed in a world completely separate from her own, worthy of admiration from a safe distance, but not really relevant to her daily life. That must be exciting for him, I managed, wondering how she'd react if she knew that some of those impressive men had served under my command. It really is, she continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing particularly juicy gossip. I mean, these aren't just regular military people. These are like special forces, elite warriors, the kind of men who do those secret missions you see in movies. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it, but Delilah remained completely oblivious to the fact that she was describing my daily reality to someone who lived it. In her mind, I was still just our cousin who plays soldier, while real military achievement belonged to people like her husband's groomsmen, men who were, at that very moment, probably wondering why she kept referring to her special operations cousin as if she were nobody worth knowing. The shift in the room's energy was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations that had been flowing with champagne-lubricated ease suddenly became more focused, more deferential. I watched from my strategically hidden table as heads turned toward the main entrance where Thomas Wellington had just appeared with his wedding party in tow. He commanded attention in the way that successful men often do, not through volume or dramatic gestures, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you belong wherever you choose to stand. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his posture carried the subtle bearing that never quite leaves former Marines, and his smile had the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to navigate both military command structures and civilian business hierarchies. But it wasn't Thomas who made my breath catch in my throat. It was the three men flanking him in matching tuxedos, their own military bearing unmistakable despite the formal civilian attire. Even from across the crowded reception hall, I recognized them immediately. Ryan Mitchell, Jake Rodriguez, and Alex Thompson. My former students, my protégés, my elite operators who had trusted me with my lives and their careers.
Oh my goodness, breathed Margaret Thornfield Wilson, abandoning her previous air of bored sophistication as she craned her neck to get a better view. Is that the groom? He's absolutely magnificent. And look at those men with him. You can tell they're military just by how they carry themselves. From my isolated vantage point, I watched the Thornfield family absorb this demonstration of Thomas's military credentials with the kind of reverence they've never shown for my own. Here was proof that military service could be prestigious when it was properly leveraged, when it was connected to the right people, when it was presented in the right context. What they didn't realize, what none of them could have predicted, was that the three men they were treating as exotic representatives of elite military culture were about to recognize their former commanding officer, sitting 20 feet away at the table they designated for family embarrassments. The evening's carefully orchestrated social dynamics were about to encounter a variable that no one had planned for: The moment when Thomas's impressive military connections collided with the family member they'd spent 20 years treating as if her own military achievements were meaningless. I took a sip of champagne and settled back in my chair, watching as Ryan's eyes began to scan the room with the systematic thoroughness that I'd trained into him during counterterrorism training exercises, where situational awareness could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. His gaze passed over the main dining area, cataloged the exits, assessed potential security concerns, and then froze when it reached the corner where I sat nursing my champagne. His expression shifted through a sequence I'd witnessed countless times during briefings when he'd suddenly grasped the full scope of an operation. Confusion, recognition, then something approaching disbelief as he processed the impossibility of finding his former commanding officer relegated to what was obviously the reception's social exile. I saw him lean toward Jake, murmuring something that made the younger SEAL's head snap in my direction. Jake's eyes widened with the same recognition, followed immediately by a frown of confusion that suggested he was trying to reconcile my presence at this wedding with the family dynamics he was witnessing. Alex noticed the shift in his teammates' attention and followed their gaze across the room. When his eyes found mine, his military bearing straightened almost imperceptibly, the automatic response of a senior enlisted man acknowledging a superior officer, even in civilian settings. 22 years of naval discipline doesn't disappear just because you're wearing a tuxedo instead of battle dress. For a moment, we simply looked at each other across the crowded reception hall. 3 men who'd served under my command in some of the most challenging operations of their careers, now seeing me treated like an unwelcome afterthought at a family celebration where they were being honored as distinguished guests. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. They were being celebrated for exactly the same military service that my family had spent years dismissing as irrelevant. Thomas was still engaged in animated conversation with Uncle Bernard about market opportunities in government contracting, completely unaware that his groomsman's attention had shifted elsewhere. Delilah continued her role as social coordinator, gathering more family members to meet the impressive military men her husband had brought into their circle. But Ryan, Jake, and Alex were no longer fully present in those conversations. I could see the subtle signs of their tactical training asserting itself, the way they positioned themselves to maintain visual contact with my corner of the room, the slight tension in their postures that suggested they were processing an unexpected development that required careful consideration. Ryan excused himself from a conversation with Aunt Caroline about Homeland Security consulting opportunities, his movement casual but purposeful, as he began navigating through the clusters of wedding guests. His approach wasn't direct, too much military training to make his intentions obvious, but his destination was unmistakable. Jake followed 30 seconds later, using a different route that would position him at a different angle. Alex waited another minute before beginning his own movement, the 3 of them executing an unconscious formation that spoke to hundreds of hours of coordinated operations. Margaret Thornfield Wilson, seated beside me, was oblivious to the tactical ballet unfolding across the reception hall. She'd returned to discussing her daughter's private school applications, apparently having exhausted her interest in the military celebrities who'd elevated the evening's social significance. Victoria, Ryan's voice was quiet, respectful, and carried undertones of something that might have been anger, though whether directed at me or the situation, I couldn't immediately tell. He'd approached from behind, the way I'd taught him to make contact in potentially hostile environments where drawing attention could compromise operational security. I turned in my chair, maintaining the kind of calm composure that had become second nature during 15 years of command responsibilities. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, you look well?" The formal address seemed to steady him, providing familiar ground in what was clearly an unsettling situation. "Ma'am,
We didn't expect to see you here. Jake arrived at our table, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes reflecting the same confusion that Ryan was struggling to mask. Commanding Hayes, this is expected. Margaret looked up from her school application discussion, her expression shifting from mild annoyance at the interruption to sudden alertness as she realized that two of the evening's military celebrities had approached our forgotten corner table. More than that, they were addressing me with the kind of respectful formality that suggested professional relationship rather than casual conversation.
I'm sorry, she interjected, her voice carrying the slight strain of someone trying to process information that didn't fit her established understanding. Do you gentlemen know Victoria? The question hung in the air like a challenge that none of us quite knew how to answer. How do you explain that the family member they'd relegated to social invisibility was the commanding officer who'd shaped these men's entire approach to military service? How do you bridge the gap between their dismissal of my achievements and their reverence for the warriors I'd trained? Ryan's training kicked in first, his diplomatic skills honed through years of interagency coordination and high-level briefings. Ma'am, we've had the honor of serving with Lieutenant Commander Hayes in various operations. The careful phrasing was perfect, truthful without being specific, respectful without revealing classified details, informative enough to establish credibility without compromising operational security. But it was also diplomatic enough to avoid directly contradicting the family narrative that had positioned me as someone whose military service didn't warrant serious consideration. Alex had joined us by then, completing their unconscious formation around my table. The sight of 3 Navy SEALs in formal dress surrounding the corner where I'd been strategically hidden was beginning to draw attention from other parts of the reception. I could see conversations pausing as people tried to understand why the evening's most prestigious military guests had abandoned their positions of honor to cluster around someone who'd been introduced as nobody special. The social mathematics didn't compute. If I was truly as insignificant as the family had suggested, why were these elite warriors treating me with obvious deference? Various operations, Margaret repeated, her tone suggesting she was testing the phrase to see if it meant what she thought it might mean. You mean you've worked together? In the military? Jake nodded, his respect for me evident despite his obvious confusion about the family dynamics he'd walked into. Yes, ma'am. Commander Hayes has been instrumental in our professional development. The euphemism was beautifully chosen. Professional development could mean anything from attending the same training courses to serving in the same units. It didn't reveal that I'd been their commanding officer, that I'd personally selected them for elite assignments, that their current skill sets were largely the result of training programs I'd designed and implemented. But it did establish that their connection to me was significant enough to warrant the respectful approach they'd just demonstrated in front of a room full of people who'd been told I was someone whose military career didn't warrant acknowledgement. Across the reception hall, I could see that our interaction was beginning to create ripples of confusion throughout the Thornfield family network. Delilah had noticed that her impressive military groomsmen were no longer available for introductions, and she was scanning the room to locate them. Thomas was beginning to look around for his missing wedding party, his expression suggesting mild concern about their sudden absence from his circle of admirers. Uncle Bernard, who'd been holding court with stories about his latest real estate acquisitions, was staring across the room with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. The woman he'd been told was the family's military embarrassment was somehow commanding the attention of the men he'd just finished praising as examples of elite military achievement. The power dynamic that had defined the entire evening was beginning to shift in ways that no one quite understood yet, but everyone could sense.
The carefully constructed social hierarchy that had placed me at the margins while elevating Thomas's military connections was encountering a variable that threatened to invert everything they thought they knew about military service and family status. Ryan was watching my face, waiting for some signal about how to proceed. His tactical instincts were telling him that something was wrong with this situation, that a commanding officer shouldn't be isolated in a corner while lesser-ranked individuals were celebrated as honored guests. But his diplomatic training was also warning him that family dynamics often operated according to rules that had nothing to do with military hierarchy or professional achievement. The moment of decision was approaching. In about 30 seconds, someone was going to ask a direct question that would require a direct answer, and the careful diplomatic language we'd been using would no longer be sufficient to maintain the fiction that my military service was somehow less significant than the warriors I'd trained. The moment of truth arrived when Thomas himself approached our table, his expression a mixture of curiosity and mild concern as he tried to understand why his entire wedding party had abandoned their ceremonial duties to cluster around a guest he'd never met. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to command, "I hope everything's all right over here." Ryan straightened immediately, his response automatic and precise. "Yes, sir, we were just—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to explain the situation without overstepping boundaries that he wasn't sure how to navigate. Thomas's eyes shifted to me, taking in my blue dresses with the kind of professional assessment that comes from years of military experience. His gaze lingered on my ribbon rack, and I saw the moment when recognition dawned, not of me personally, but of what those ribbons represented. The Navy Cross, the Silver Star, the Defense Superior Service Medal. Decorations that told a story of combat leadership and operational excellence that couldn't be dismissed or minimized.
"Thomas Wellington," he said, extending his hand with the kind of respectful formality reserved for fellow military officers. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hayes," I replied, accepting his handshake and noting the slight surprise in his expression as he processed my rank and name combination. Behind Thomas, I could see Delilah approaching with her characteristic determined stride, her wedding dress rustling with the urgency of someone who'd realized that her carefully orchestrated evening was developing an unexpected complication. Her face carried the expression of a hostess who'd discovered that her seating arrangement had somehow gone catastrophically wrong. "Thomas, darling," she said, her voice pitched with the kind of forced lightness that suggested barely controlled panic, "you're missing your own reception. People are asking for you." But Thomas wasn't listening. His military training had engaged the moment he'd shaken my hand, and he was now studying my uniform with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complex than he'd expected. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," he repeated slowly, and I could see him processing the information, connecting dots that were creating a picture he wasn't sure he understood. "Have we served together? Your name seems familiar." Jake stepped forward, his diplomatic restraint finally reaching its limits. "Sir, Commander Hayes was our commanding officer at DVGRU. She developed most of the training protocols that we—" "DVGRU?" Thomas interrupted, his voice sharp with sudden understanding. The Naval Special Operations Development Group wasn't just any military assignment. It was one of the most elite and classified units in the entire special operations community. You commanded at Dam Neck? The conversation was beginning to attract attention from nearby tables. Margaret Thornfield Wilson was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, clearly trying to reconcile this discussion of elite military commands with her understanding of me as the family's professional disappointment. Other family members were beginning to drift closer, drawn by the unmistakable shift in energy around our previously forgotten corner. "Thomas, darling," she said, her voice pitched with the kind of forced lightness that suggested barely controlled panic. "You're missing your own reception. People are asking for you." But Thomas wasn't listening. His military training had engaged the moment he'd shaken my hand, and he was now studying my uniform with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become much more complex than he'd expected. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," he repeated slowly, and I could see him processing the information, connecting dots that were creating a picture he wasn't sure he understood. "The psychological warfare protocols," he said slowly, pieces clicking into place in his mind. "Those were your innovations? The entire special operations community has been implementing variations of your training methods. I've seen the after-action reports, the improvement in operator resilience and decision-making under extreme stress." Delilah had gone very still beside him, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips as she processed a conversation that was revealing her military cousin to be someone whose professional achievements far exceeded anything she had imagined possible. Uncle Bernard had pushed through the gathering crowd of family members, his face carrying the expression of someone who'd overheard enough technical military discussion to realize that something significant was happening, even if he didn't understand the details. "Victoria," he said, his voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before, "these gentlemen are saying you were their commanding officer?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to 20 years of family assumptions. Every conversation we had ever had about my limited military career, every dismissive comment about my playing soldier, every suggestion that I should find a real job, all of it was suddenly being confronted with evidence that contradicted their fundamental understanding of what I'd actually accomplished. Ryan stepped forward, his respect for me overriding any concern about family diplomacy. "Sir, Commander Hayes didn't just command us. She transformed how the entire Naval Special Operations community approaches operator training and psychological preparation. Her work has been classified and distributed throughout Special Operations commands worldwide." "Classified," Margaret repeated faintly, as if the word represented a concept she had never associated with any member of her family. Jake nodded, his enthusiasm for my achievements overcoming his natural diplomatic restraint. "Ma'am, the commander's research on stress inoculation training is considered groundbreaking. She's published papers that have influenced military psychology protocols across all service branches. Her work has literally saved lives by preparing operators for psychological challenges that previous training methods couldn't address." The crowd around our table was growing larger, drawn by a conversation that was revealing layers of achievement and professional respect that no one had anticipated. Aunt Caroline had joined the group, her carefully maintained social composure cracking as she tried to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about her military niece.
Thomas was still staring at me, his expression shifting from surprise to something approaching awe as he continued to connect the dots between my visible achievements and the broader impact I'd had on the military community he'd once been part of. "The character reference," he said suddenly, his voice carrying a note of revelation. 3 years ago, when I was transitioning out of the Marines and applying for security clearances, one of my references was from a Lieutenant Commander V. Hayes at DevGru. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the background noise of the reception seemed to fade as the full implications of his statement settled over the assembled family members. "That was you!" Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "You wrote the recommendation that opened every door for my business. Wellington Security Solutions exists because you vouched for my character and capabilities to the defense contracting community." Delilah's champagne flute slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor in a spray of crystal and wine that seemed to punctuate the moment when 20 years of family assumptions finally shattered along with it. The woman they'd dismissed as nobody special had personally created the foundation for her husband's entire business empire. The military service they'd treated as an embarrassment had directly enabled the success they were celebrating. The cousin they'd relegated to social exile had shaped the careers of the very men they'd been honoring as examples of military excellence. The power dynamic that had defined the entire evening, that had defined 20 years of family relationships, had just inverted completely.
And everyone in that growing circle around table 12 was beginning to understand that they had fundamentally been wrong about everything they thought they knew about Lieutenant Commander Victoria Hayes. The silence that followed Thomas's revelation stretched across the reception hall like a held breath. I could see the calculations happening behind my family's eyes. 20 years of dismissive comments, missed opportunities for connection, deliberate exclusions from family celebrations. They were suddenly faced with the mathematical impossibility of their position. They had spent 2 decades treating their most accomplished family member as their greatest disappointment. I had a choice to make in that moment, and I could feel the weight of it settling on my shoulders like the responsibility I'd carried during combat operations where the wrong decision could cost lives. The difference was that this time the lives at stake were relationships, family bonds, and the emotional well-being of people who had hurt me deeply but who were still, irrevocably, my blood. Uncle Bernard was the first to attempt damage control, his businessman's instincts kicking in as he tried to navigate what was clearly a catastrophic miscommunication that had persisted for far longer than anyone had intended. "Victoria," he said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to defuse a potentially explosive situation, "I think there may have been some misunderstandings over the years. We never meant to minimize your achievements. We simply didn't understand the scope of your responsibilities." It was a diplomatic opening, an invitation to allow everyone to save face by attributing 20 years of deliberate dismissal to innocent misunderstanding rather than willful ignorance. The easy path would have been to accept that explanation, to let them rewrite history in a way that made their behavior seem forgivable rather than inexcusable. But I had learned something during my years of command that Uncle Bernard had never grasped in his decades of business success. True leadership isn't about making things easy for people who have failed to meet their responsibilities. True leadership is about creating accountability while maintaining dignity. "Uncle Bernard," I replied, my voice carrying the measured tone I'd used during countless briefings where accurate information was more important than comfortable feelings. "I don't think there were any misunderstandings. I think there were assumptions that no one bothered to verify." Aunt Caroline stepped forward, her pearls catching the light, as she gestured with the kind of gracious authority she'd perfected during years of charity galas and social events. "Well, of course we're proud of your service, dear. We've always been proud. Perhaps we simply didn't know how to express it properly." The revision was smooth, practiced, the kind of social aikido that wealthy families use to redirect uncomfortable truths into more palatable narratives. But it was also fundamentally dishonest, and I'd spent too many years in situations where lives depended on truthful assessment to let dishonesty pass unchallenged. "Aunt Caroline," I said gently, "you told people at Dad's funeral that my uniform was inappropriate because it drew attention away from the family. You didn't say you were proud. You said I was embarrassing."
"I never meant," she began, then stopped, apparently realizing that any explanation of what she'd meant would only make her position worse. This was the moment I dreamed about during the darkest periods of family rejection, the opportunity to hold up a mirror to their behavior, to force them to confront the pain they'd caused, to watch them scramble for explanations that could somehow justify 2 decades of deliberate diminishment. I could have destroyed them, not just emotionally, but socially. In a room full of their peers, surrounded by witnesses who would carry the story throughout their social circles, I could have detailed every slight, every dismissal, every casual cruelty they'd inflicted while I was serving my country in ways they'd never bothered to understand. Ryan was watching my face with the intense attention of someone who'd seen me make life or death decisions under pressure. He knew that tone in my voice, knew the look in my eyes when I was weighing options that could have far-reaching consequences. Jake and Alex had positioned themselves slightly behind him, their military bearings suggesting they were prepared to support whatever decision I made about how to handle this family confrontation. Thomas was still processing the revelation that his entire business empire had been built on a recommendation from the woman his wife had just finished dismissing as nobody special.
His expression suggested he was beginning to understand that he'd walked into a family dynamic that was far more complex and damaging than he'd realized. But as I looked around the circle of family members who were waiting for my response, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't want revenge. I wanted something much more difficult to achieve and much more valuable in the long term. I wanted understanding. "Here's what I think happened," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd used during after-action reviews when it was important to analyze failures without destroying morale. "I made a choice that didn't fit your definition of success, and instead of trying to understand that choice, you decided it was wrong. For 20 years, you've been waiting for me to admit my mistake and choose a path that made sense to you." Uncle Bernard started to interrupt, but I held up a hand with the quiet authority that had stopped arguments in briefing rooms filled with colonels and admirals. But the mistake wasn't mine. The mistake was assuming that success has only one definition and that anything outside that definition isn't worth your time or respect. Aunt Caroline's eyes were bright with what might have been tears, though whether they were tears of regret or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "Victoria," my mother's voice came from behind the crowd, barely above a whisper. She'd been standing at the edge of our circle, apparently having approached during the revelations about my professional achievements. "I never stopped being proud of you. I didn't know how to stand up to them." It was the first honest thing anyone had said since this conversation began, and it hit me harder than all the technical discussions about my military achievements combined. My mother hadn't rejected me. She'd been afraid to defend me. I looked around the circle again, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in 20 years. They weren't evil people. They weren't even particularly cruel people. They were limited people who'd let their limitations define their relationship with someone whose life existed outside their understanding. "I forgive you," I said simply, and watched the relief flood across their faces. "But I need you to understand something. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means choosing to build something better going forward. The choice to forgive rather than destroy, to educate rather than humiliate, to heal rather than wound, it was the hardest decision I'd made all evening. But it was also the decision that reflected who I'd become during 15 years of military service, rather than who I might have been if I'd let their rejection define me." Thomas stepped forward, his expression serious and respectful. "Commander Hayes, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you a debt that I'm not sure I can ever repay. Would you be willing to discuss how I might begin to make amends for the way my family has treated the person responsible for everything I've achieved?" It was a generous offer, thoughtfully phrased, and it demonstrated exactly the kind of character that had made me write that recommendation 3 years earlier. But as I considered my response, I realized that what I wanted wasn't financial compensation or business opportunities. What I wanted was something much simpler and much more precious, a family that finally understood who I was and what I'd chosen to dedicate my life to serving. As the evening began to wind down and the initial shock of revelation settled into something approaching normal conversation, I excused myself to step outside onto the Manor's terrace. The weight of 20 years of family dysfunction, followed by an evening of dramatic reconciliation, had left me needing a moment of quiet to process everything that had changed. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of late-blooming roses from the Manor's gardens. Behind me, through the French doors, I could see the reception continuing with a fundamentally altered dynamic. My family members were now engaging with Ryan, Jake, and Alex as if they were oracles of military wisdom, asking detailed questions about special operations and my role in shaping modern naval warfare tactics. I was scrolling through messages on my phone, checking for any urgent communications for my current assignment, when an unknown number appeared on my screen. In my line of work, unknown numbers during off-duty hours usually meant one of two things: a family emergency or a national security situation that required immediate attention. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," I answered, maintaining the professional tone that had become second nature after 15 years of being on call for emergencies that could range from training accidents to international incidents. "Commander Hayes, this is Admiral Patricia Reynolds, Naval Special Warfare Command. I hope I'm not interrupting your evening, but I have something time-sensitive to discuss with you." Admiral Reynolds. I knew the name, of course. Every special operations officer knew the woman who'd become the first female admiral to command NavSpec Warcom. But we'd never spoken directly, and her calling my personal cell phone on a Saturday evening suggested something significant was developing. Not at all, Admiral. How can I assist you? Commander, I'm calling to inform you that you've been selected for promotion to captain, effective immediately. But more importantly, I'm calling to offer you command of the new Joint Special Operations Training Center that we're establishing at Eglin Air Force Base. It's a joint service facility that will standardize psychological preparation protocols across all special operations branches. I felt my breath catch. The Joint Special Operations Training Center was a project that had been discussed in classified briefings for over 2 years, a revolutionary approach to preparing elite warriors that would combine the best practices from all service branches under unified command. It was exactly the kind of assignment that represented the pinnacle of a special operations career. Admiral, I'm honored by the offer, but I should mention that I'm currently attending a family wedding in Millfield Creek. She interrupted with what sounded like amusement in her voice. Commander, do you think we offer command positions of this magnitude without thoroughly researching the officer's background and current activities? The implications of that statement settled over me like a revelation. The military's intelligence networks were sophisticated enough to track my personal activities, which meant they'd also been monitoring my family situation, my professional isolation from the Thornfield social circles, and probably the entire dynamic that had played out at this wedding. Commander Hayes, Admiral Reynolds continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone, your family's failure to recognize your achievements has been noted at the highest levels of Naval Command, not because we make personnel decisions based on family dynamics, but because officers of your caliber tend to attract attention from multiple sources, including those who wonder why someone with your accomplishments maintains such a low profile in civilian circles. The idea that my family's rejection had been observed and documented by senior military leadership was both embarrassing and oddly validating. They'd noticed that something was unusual about my situation, even if they hadn't intervened directly. The assignment I'm offering you, she continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone, comes with a promotion to captain, a budget of $300 million annually, and direct reporting to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You'll be responsible for developing psychological warfare training that will be implemented across every special operations unit in the American military. Your innovations will quite literally shape how we prepare our most elite warriors for the next generation of conflicts. $300 million, direct reporting to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, influence over every special operations branch in the military. It was the kind of career opportunity that comes along once in a lifetime, the kind of assignment that transforms an officer from accomplished professional to legendary figure in military history. Admiral, there's one more thing, Commander, Admiral Reynolds added, and I could hear something that might have been satisfaction in her voice. The appointment comes with automatic inclusion in the Defense Intelligence Agency's advisory board, which means your clearance level will be upgraded to the highest classification levels. You'll be briefed on programs that currently involve fewer than 50 people worldwide. I looked back through the French doors at my family, now clustered around the Navy SEALs, who are probably describing training exercises I'd designed, operations I'd planned, innovations I'd developed that had saved lives and enhanced American military capabilities in ways they were only beginning to understand. Admiral, I said, making the only decision that made sense, I accept the assignment. Outstanding. Congratulations, Captain Hayes. You'll receive formal notification and briefing materials via secure channels Monday morning. Enjoy the rest of your family celebration. The call ended, leaving me standing on the terrace with the realization that in the span of a single evening, everything had changed. Not just my relationship with my family, but my entire military career trajectory. I walked back into the reception where Thomas was deep in conversation with Uncle Bernard about government contracting opportunities that might benefit from military expertise. Delilah was listening to Jake describe the psychological demands of special operations training with the fascination of someone discovering an entirely new world of human achievement.
My mother approached me as I rejoined the group, her expression carrying a mixture of pride and regret that suggested she was still processing the evening's revelations. Victoria, I know I have no right to ask this after all these years, but would you be willing to have dinner with me next week? Just the two of us. I think it's time I learned about the daughter I've been too afraid to know. Before I could answer, Ryan stepped forward with the kind of respectful attention that suggested he had something important to communicate. Ma'am, if I may, I'd like to say something to your family.
I nodded, curious to see what my former student felt was important enough to address to people who'd spent the evening learning how wrong they'd been about everything they thought they knew about military service. Ryan turned to face the assembled Thornfield family members, his bearing shifting into the formal presentation mode I'd seen him use during high-level briefings. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I want you to understand something that may not be obvious from tonight's conversations. Captain Hayes, and yes, she was just promoted to captain about 10 minutes ago, isn't just an exceptional military officer. She's a visionary leader whose innovations have fundamentally changed how America's elite warriors prepare for combat." He paused, making eye contact with each family member to ensure they understood the significance of what he was saying. The psychological preparation protocols she developed have been implemented by special operations forces in 12 allied nations. Her research has been classified and distributed to military psychologists worldwide. The training methods she pioneered have reduced combat stress casualties while improving mission effectiveness across every metric we measure. Jake stepped forward to join Ryan, adding his own perspective to what was becoming an impromptu briefing about my professional achievements. "What Staff Sergeant Mitchell is saying," Jake continued, "is that Captain Hayes isn't just a family member you should be proud of. She's a military leader whose work will influence special operations training for the next 50 years. Her legacy will be studied in war colleges and special operations schools long after all of us have retired." Alex completed the presentation with the kind of senior enlisted perspective that carries particular weight in military discussions. "Ma'am," he said, addressing my mother directly, "your daughter has spent 15 years making America safer by ensuring that our most elite warriors are psychologically prepared for challenges that most people can't imagine. She's saved lives, prevented failures, and enhanced capabilities in ways that will never be publicly acknowledged, but that have made a measurable difference in our national security." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted earlier revelations. This was the silence of people finally understanding not just what I did, but why it mattered. Uncle Bernard was the first to speak, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd finally grasped the full scope of a situation he'd been misunderstanding for decades. "Victoria," he said, "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I have words for. We didn't just fail to understand your achievements, we failed to understand that you were achieving things that we couldn't even comprehend." Sometimes the most powerful moment in your life isn't when people finally see who you are. Sometimes it's when you realize that you don't need their vision to know your own worth. But when their vision finally aligns with reality, when the people who should have known better finally understand what they missed, the validation can be overwhelming. As I looked around the circle of family members who were finally seeing me clearly, I realized that the real lesson of this evening wasn't about family dynamics or military service or the importance of recognition. The real lesson was about patience, about building something meaningful even when the people closest to you can't see its value, about continuing to serve, to achieve, to lead, even when your achievements aren't acknowledged by the people whose acknowledgement would mean the most. Because sometimes, if you're patient enough and strong enough and committed enough to your principles, the truth has a way of revealing itself in moments that change everything. The wedding reception was ending, but my relationship with my family was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.